Everybody, we are officially live. I'm so excited to kick off another episode of our pre-executive symposium panel. We are about to have another executive symposium in 1 week in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We're hosting it at Schneider Electric in Carrollton, Texas. The topic is how to effectively lead multinational and multicultural teams. And as we lead up to our executive symposiums, we have these pre-symposium panels as a way for the attendees of our events to share their insight, their knowledge about what they've done and experience when it comes to leading multinational and multicultural teams. And for other people that are going to come and attend to the event to see, okay, who else is going to be there? What are some interesting insights on the topic? And, if you're maybe not local to the DFW area and you're like, gosh darn, I wish I could see the panel, or I wish I could get some insights from this topic. It's really interesting to me. We have this as an option to allow people to learn more about the topic and to engage with the community. So we've got three great pre-symposium panelists with us here today. We've got Shonna Andersen, we've got Liz Griffin, we've got Stephen Sample. I'll have each one of them introduce themselves before we kick off. Shonna, do you mind going first?
Of course. Yep. So Shonna Andersen, I lead HR for a small organization now called Smart Links. We are completely remote. However, prior to this, I was with a very large organization, a BPO organization, Conduent, which was multinational, global, and other companies like Citigroup, Sabre, have about probably 25 plus years of HR experience. And I'm here in the Fort Worth area.
Very nice. Liz, how about you?
Sure. I'm Liz. I'm in the Dallas area, and I've had the privilege of supporting multinational, multicultural teams across global contact centers. I've also had experience supporting startups, both from a people perspective as well as an operations perspective, deploying multi-global solutions, and it's been great. And toss it back to you.
Amazing. Stephen, how about you?
Hi, Steve Sample. I run HR for a small to mid-sized logistics company. We're part of a much larger Korean conglomerate, but we are their logistics division here in the U.S. And we're in kind of growth mode, pushing hard into 2024 and 2025.
That's exciting. And I'm Garrett. I'm the founder of Ambition in Motion. At Ambition in Motion, our vision is a world where the vast majority of people are excited to go to work. When they are there, their expectations meet reality, and when they come home, they feel fulfilled. And we believe that starts with leaders, because leaders create the experiences employees have while at work. And so we create technologies and communities to empower leaders to be their best selves for their teams. And one of the ways that we build community is through executive symposiums and just bringing forums together for leaders to discuss their challenges, discuss things that they've learned, and more or less share insights that more or less can ideally help other leaders more effectively lead their team. We believe that leadership can be a lonely place sometimes, and having other leaders to at least bounce our challenges off of can be a great avenue for us to improve. So let's dive in. So I want to dive right deep into the meaty heart of one interesting element of leading multinational and multicultural teams, and that's psychological safety and security. I often find that a lot of times, especially in a lot of different cultures, team members are reticent to admit mistakes. It's very oftentimes looked down upon to say like, oh, I messed this thing up. And so sometimes what I'll see is, you got a team member that's from a different country, they might say, they might mess something up, and instead of telling anybody else that they've messed this up, they'll try to put on the hero cape and fix it themselves, but potentially it metastasizes and it gets worse. And then you're like, oh my gosh, if you had shared this from the very beginning, we could have, as a team, rallied around this challenge, fixed it immediately instead of letting it balloon into this giant thing. So the first question I'd love to ask is, how do you go about building psychological safety and security with your multinational and multicultural teams? And is it different than maybe the way that you lead teams domestically? Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in.
Sure.
And I think acknowledging it, right? Acknowledging that safe space and why it's important. And that can start creating that open dialogue and kind of lowering those boundaries. I've experienced exactly what you're talking about. And I want to tie it to your opening statement. When you said you create environments so people be their best selves every day, I take that like motto, and what I say, let's flip that. And how do you be your best self on a really tough day? It's raising your hand. right? If you have a question or if you're unsure, raise your hand and create a dialogue where there's paths of communication to where if there is an uh-oh or you need to raise your hand, that people don't feel like they've made a mistake or they're ashamed and they don't want to open that bridge. Shonna, you're going to add something?
No, I mean, I definitely agree to that. One of the things that I would say that I've worked really hard to do with the multinational teams is the cultural awareness with the other teams, because you will have some groups that, as exactly like you said, Garrett, are maybe afraid to speak up when they've made a mistake. And it is just a cultural, it's ingrained in their culture. They are pleasing, they want to say yes. And I think making others who work with them aware of that culture and the other cultures that they work with throughout the globe is so important, so that they can maybe kind of recognize when the person may be expanding on the truth a little bit, or kind of dive deeper to understand and get maybe more data behind what they are saying. Just because, again, there are some cultures that are just so eager to please and they don't want to disappoint you. So we've got to recognize that in the other cultures that are working with them.
And to close the loop on that, it made me think it's the feedback loop. So when you see something in action that's happened and you've addressed it, how can you spotlight that in a really positive way to encourage other people to model that behavior of raising their hand, right? And so you kind of incorporate that into it's not a one-time deal. It's a continuous conversation. So that trust that we're talking about, it just builds on top of each other.
Yeah, and I think for me and my organization, we spend a fair amount of time talking about, we're kind of in startup mode. So, we're not this Fortune 500 well-oiled, smooth running machine all the time. And so we have to acknowledge and talk about that, like Liz said, that this is our reality. There's going to be some hiccups, there's going to be some bumps, but ultimately we're all trying to drive towards this goal, whatever that may be. And it's okay to make mistakes. I think, in my situation, sometimes people are a little hesitant to kind of admit that they dropped the ball. And what I try to work with leaders on and remind them is say, look, I mean, everybody makes mistakes. The worst thing you can do is to make a mistake and then try to cover it up, or not just raise your hand and say, my bad, because we all make mistakes. We're all going to hit those road bumps. But just acknowledging them and moving on and course correcting as soon as you can is the best way forward.
Yeah, you're all bringing up this interesting point that, Liz, you talk about acknowledging the safe space, and Shonna, you talk about cultural awareness of other teams. I think that's really good. And Liz, you brought back this concept of feedback loops, and then Stephen, you were talking a lot about just not allowing a scenario to metastasize and just be able to admit the mistake itself. The word that just is screaming out at me is conscientiousness.
Yeah.
And that's just like, I don't know, for whatever reason, I'm hearing all three of these and I'm like, gosh, conscientiousness is the word here. And I think it goes in multiple directions, and I'd be curious to learn your thoughts on this. So one, let's start with acknowledging the safe space. So, Liz, you said, hey, can we acknowledge a safe space? The question I have is around hierarchy. I think like when we're on top, when we're like the top dog in our organizational hierarchy, it's really easy to acknowledge a safe space. Why? Because we're the safest person in this space.
Yeah.
Nobody is at risk here. There's no perception of any risk when we are the top dog within a space. And so I think it's really, I'd be curious to know, how can we be conscientious in that sort of scenario? The other question, and it revolves around conscientiousness, revolves around the, Shonna, you talking about cultural awareness of other teams. This goes to the flip side. If you ever talk to a friend and they tell their scenario of their boss and they vilify their boss, they're like, he or she keeps asking me to do this, and this. They've got no idea how much is on my plate. And like a natural question I'm thinking in the back of my mind is, okay, well, did you kind of convey like what's on your plate and like what balls might be dropped if like a new thing gets added to it? Well, I kind of have. I mean, I said like, fine. I figured they could figure out through the tea leaves that I wasn't really happy about getting this new task. And so I think on the flip side, you go, as the friend, you go and meet their boss and you like think, you monster. And it's like, the boss has no idea that they've overloaded this person's plate. They just were like, you seem fine. I don't, I look at you, you're like the duck on the water. You seem cool, calm, and collected. I don't realize how much you're paddling underneath the water. And
Yeah.
so how can we as leaders be, one, conscientious of the organizational hierarchy and the objectivity that may or may not exist because of we're the top dog within our organizational unit there. But at the same time, as leaders, how can we be conscientious of the work we're putting on other people's plates? Like Shonna mentioned, sometimes some team members are so eager to please that you just give them more and more and more, and you don't realize that you're burning them out, almost to the point where maybe they leave and you're like, what the heck happened? I thought we were good. But they never told you that you gave them way too much. So how as leaders can we be more conscientious?
I would say that for me, I always try to remind myself that old saying about, walk a mile in their shoes, right? And so with my team and even teams that don't necessarily report directly to me, I always try to keep that running through my head. If I have to ask someone to do something, okay. And then one thing I try to be really conscientious about is getting a realistic time frame. I wouldn't just say, hey, Garrett, go do this, right? I would say, hey, Garrett, we need to get this done. And maybe you're the SME in that area. Then I'd say, hey, when do you think you can get that done, right? What is realistic? And you may say, oh, by next Tuesday at 5 p.m. I'd be like, great. And now you and I have an expectation. But if you say Friday at 5 p.m., I'm like, that doesn't really work for me. How about Wednesday? And can you get some additional help? So I try to negotiate a little bit because I don't want to. That's the one thing I've learned in my career is that I am and my kids would attest to this. They're kind of young adults now, but they would tell you when I ask my kids to do something, what dad really means is like in the next 30 seconds. But in the professional world, that doesn't work, right? Unless it's 911 and somebody's hair is on fire. But typically I try to always remind myself, walk a mile in their shoes, and then negotiate a realistic timeline where they're not feeling just completely ground down and like they've got to work till 10 o'clock every night for the next, 3 or 4 nights in a row.
I think that's a good
One of the things I would share.
Oh yeah, jump in, Sean.
Oh, go ahead, Garrett. I'm sorry.
Oh, the only counter I have to that, and this is not even a counter, Stephen, I think that's a really good model for it. I think the thing that oftentimes happens, especially in the C-suite, is you know what? It would be great if we could do XYZ. God, what do you think it would take for us to do that? And then you're like, cool, are we pie in the skying this or are we like actually doing this?
Right.
And then, it's like 3 weeks later, they've either forgotten or they're like, what the heck? I thought we talked about making this a priority. Are we not working on this or what?
Right. That's why I think you've got to be intentional about those things. So, because those things come up all the time and you're like, and what I tell, other members of the C-suite here, I say, okay, are we all putting a stake in the ground around this? Or are we just kind of talking about this, nice, pie in the sky scenario? And they're like, no, we're absolutely putting a stake in the ground. And then I'm like, okay, what's the date? What are the expectations? What are the deliverables? How are we going to measure it? Right. And then we start having a more concrete conversation about it.
Stephen, I'm going to kind of tee off of the word you used around intentionality. That's the word that really resonates with me. It's about intentional leadership. And then, Garrett, when you talked about the hierarchy and top dog, I recently read, I can't even remember, it was on LinkedIn, and it was a post about flipping that hierarchy. I always see myself at the bottom, supporting, whether it's a small team, I've supported small teams, I've supported super huge teams. I always have viewed myself at the bottom of the support. And it's about creating that culture of safety in the sense of honest boundaries, right? And then also, I'm responsible for checking in. If I'm rattling off a list and there's a whole lot of deliverables, that comes back to intentional leadership. Are you good with this? What else is balancing? Is this date at risk? What can I do to help you, right? And so I think from a leadership perspective, we also are accountable to take the minute and take the time to pause to get that feedback. And then the other thing I kind of would add is around intentional leadership when you're, gunning it and we have to get a lot done. We have to get a lot done quickly. I also find it's really important to do team building exercises, to do fun activities, to get to know each other a little bit better. So then you can better understand, engage how your team's responding to you, because how you build culture is you get to know your employees and what they care about and what's happening to them, and what can you do to help them? And then that opens that dialogue of trust even more, so that when there is pressure or when they are concerned, they feel comfortable coming to you so that you could help support them and the broader team.
Well, hold on a second. I got a quick push on the honest boundary, but I like it. But it seems almost like a half step. And I only say that because if we don't have the psychological, so for example, like you said, like, okay, how can I help? Are we on track to meet this deadline? What can I do to support you as we, work towards this thing? Like, if we don't have the psychological safety there and we're in a very pleasing culture, we might say, yeah, we're all good, we're on track. And so is there something further we can do to help people feel comfortable with saying, like, I don't know, is there almost like a way that we can
I mean, what comes to mind, and I get the push,
okay, cool.
I think that I tie that back to the culture you're building from day one, right? Or if you've been there for a minute and you're struggling with some gaps, how do you do a reset to kind of redefine the communication? And I can't fall back to do what you're going to say and model that as a leader and help create that as a model for your team.
Interesting. So
I'm going to piggyback on that.
Yeah.
Sure.
I was going to say, and if my internet gets kind of spotty, let me know and I'll switch to my hotspot because I'm having some connection issues, of course. Sure. But I was just going to share, I think the team building is so important. And sometimes it can be really hard, especially when you are multinational and you have people in all these different time zones. And it's just, I have people now in different places in the US, but not global at this point, and it's hard here. So when you add like different time zones, that adds to it. But if I think people are comfortable with each other, then it's easier for them to maybe speak up. On the flip side, I would challenge some of this in the sense that kind of fairly recently I had a situation, and it was with one of our very senior leaders and had a person resign under them, and really thought that senior leader, he said to me, I really believed I knew everything that was on that person's plate, and just out of nowhere, person resigned, they were overwhelmed. And when he had that individual kind of write everything up that the person did, he said, I had no idea these were all the things he was working on. So, I kind of thought back to just some things that I've read and done in the past. And that's when you're having those weekly or biweekly one-on-ones to talk through, okay, what are you working on? And, here's a new task I need to give you. But if I give you this, is this, and not so much even when can you get this done to me, but can you do this? Or do we need to take something else off your plate that's a lower priority? Because what I find sometimes is you mold a position for a person and you just start giving them things, and eventually you really don't know everything that they are working on until they write it all out, and then we're completely surprised. So, I think allowing for that opportunity during your one-on-ones so that they can share, here's what I'm working on, and that you have that realization, it gives them that kind of psychological safety, the security to be open with you and say, here's what I'm working on, here's how long it's taking. And yeah, I could do that, but if I did that, I'd have to work, 20 hours in a day. So you can start balancing the work that they are doing, and then get the realistic timeframes, kind of like you said, Stephen. So that's kind of my thought on it, which is a little different, I think, than Liz and Stephen, but it just adds that complexity there.
Completely agree. I think everything you're saying, I think that's an add-on to like what my initial topic was. And I think what I've seen personally is the one-on-ones. It can vary across leader and across teams. Some aren't consistent. Some don't have documentation that they use. Some they view it as a catch-up informal call where an employee, and it happens. I've seen it, I've seen it broadly. And so I think even if you're in a leadership position, how do you help create the mechanism so that there is that documentation that facilitates the conversation that you need to have?
Yeah,
So, oh yeah,
the only thing I would add to that is I'm a big Marcus Buckingham guy who wrote that book, First Break All the Rules. And if you watch his videos on YouTube, he consistently says one thing, which is, and I try to drive this wherever I am. The best leaders do one thing consistently. They meet with their team on a regular basis for 15 minutes. It's not a heavy duty, bring 10 PowerPoint slides. They sit down, they say, Garrett, what are you working on and how can I help? That's it. And if you're doing that every week for 15 minutes, if Garrett knows he and I are going to meet from 10 to 10:15 every Tuesday, and I'm going to ask him those two questions, then I'll always know if he's got way too much on his plate or not enough. Or because my job as his boss is to help him knock down walls, bust through barriers, find workarounds, answer questions. So that's the main way I try to approach that.
how do we avoid, so this concept, like all of you are saying, this is really interesting. I wrote down time priority audits. I think that's like a really interesting way of doing this. At least that's kind of like how I summed it up. But I guess the question I have, it's a two-parter. One, how can we avoid micromanaging? So like, how can we avoid us micromanaging another person's time? And then the second is, how can we avoid assumptions about how much time we think this work should be taking? I think oftentimes, like as a non-technical leader, when I'm leading a technical team or I'm chatting with my technical counterparts, I'm like, we're just making an app. Like it's a Gmail. It pulls up on my phone. What's so hard about it? Is I click and it works. Like what? Why is that so difficult to do? And they're like, Gary, you severely underestimate and do not know all the technical capabilities or things that go into making this. And so I think oftentimes as leaders, there are tasks that we assign that we think are really easy peasy lemon squeezy, but in reality, it takes a whole lot longer to do. And so I think it's easy for people and leaders to start formulating negative assumptions about colleagues based on the amount of time it's taking them to do something that we thought would be really easy for them to do. Could they be juicing it? Maybe. But are they juicing it? Likely not, but you just kind of got to take their word for it. How do we go about avoiding those assumptions? Does that question make sense?
Totally makes sense. I'm pausing to see if someone wants to jump in first. Yeah, it makes sense. I've been in a position where I'm like, that's going to take a lot longer.
Yep. And it's interesting because I'm reading a book right now by John Cotter, and this is one of the things it's talking about. It's all about change, but as it talks about it, it says, we make these assumptions on how long it will take, and if they had a dedicated time to do this, that's probably how long it would take. But what we don't take into account are all the distractions that come into play, or these other priorities that they are working on that we just kind of aren't thinking of. We're like, well, if you just go do this and do it from A to Z, that it'll only take you this time. So it goes back, I think, even to what Liz said, is that, the team building, the building the relationship so that people are comfortable enough to share, okay, if I take this on, you're saying you think that it'll be done in a week. It probably is going to take 2, and here's why. But you have to build that relationship. And again, I find it more so, I think, with the teams that are international than my US teams. They a lot of times are more open and more honest about what's on their plate than the people pleasers that I find in other countries. So that's just kind of something to think about as well, is it's not just that one thing, it's all the other distractions that come up during the day or the fires that they have to put out that we just aren't thinking of.
What you shared made me think of the kind of what's the must do and then what's your prioritization list, right? And then when you're working cross-functionally, you have other cross-functional peers that have other competing priorities. Then you come into a little bit of negotiation, right? So you're negotiating on behalf of your team because you need to get a deliverable done. You're trying to understand their prioritization. And then it's, okay, you're telling me it's going to take 8 weeks. I need it in 5 weeks. Is it possible to split the difference? And what are the 3 things that we're going to deprioritize so that we can get it done? And I think that takes leaders, right? You want to empower your team to not micromanage. And I think in larger companies, one-on-ones, some are frequently, a lot it's a minimum of once a month one-on-one. And so you're maybe not touching, if you have a large expansive team, you're not touching them as often. And so when you are doing these group meetings, it's really important to be clear around what's important, what's the must-dos, and then ask, are there concerns, are there questions? Is there something I'm forgetting, right? Or you guys have watch-outs that I need to know, where even in the questions that you're asking, making yourself approachable so that there is a minute for those responses to come in.
I would like, the only thing I'd add to that, Liz,
Sure.
and this is the thing that I think was even missing in what Shonna was sharing, and I'd be curious to learn what your thoughts are on this, but determining and clarifying the level of doneness. So like, have you ever been like camping out in the woods trying to watch, let's say like a YouTube video? YouTube will optimize its screen clarity based on how much bandwidth you've got. So if you've got low bandwidth, it's going to be 480p, which means you could barely make out any of the images going on. And maybe in a scenario for work, that's good enough. You're just looking for the 480p. You're not going to get that much clarity. That's fine. You know, maybe you need something a little better, maybe like 780p. But if it's like needs to be really crystal clear, like 1080p, like very crystal clear, like your team can create a Mona Lisa, or they can create something that's just good enough to get done. I think that's another thing that's often missing when giving those instructions is level of doneness, because we might be thinking like this task should take a week. And they're like, well, yeah, if you're just trying to like just throw something against the wall and like see if it sticks, sure. But if you're trying to make something really good, this is going to take a month and a half. And so I think that's oftentimes where there's a misunderstanding, is the clarity around the level of doneness and what the expectation is there.
And I almost think that's a first pass by X. You'll get feedback, then we'll tighten up, and we'll have final by Z, you know? And the other thing, Stephen, when you talked about kind of what's on your plate, how can I help during the one-on-ones, advice I got from an amazing leader that has always stuck with me is when it's individual interactions and there's big decisions that need to be made, it's the what, the so what, and the now what, and what are the options? And which one do you recommend, right? To where it's framed up in a very simple way that doesn't require a 10-point power page slide. And then, you know, in regards to level of doneness, right? Some want a really finalized presentation, but let's keep it basic, and it doesn't have to be pretty until we get the core concepts down, and then we can wrap it up and put a bow on it. And I think that with the teams I've worked with, they understand my style pretty quickly. So we kind of avoid the confusion around, you know, it being perfect, because it doesn't need to be perfect. It's like, would you be proud of the idea? Or are you proud of what you're coming to the table with? And then we can make it pretty.
Yeah, I think, you know, to the original question, Garrett, about like, is it done enough? Years ago, you know, you guys have probably heard this concept of, you know, begin with the end in mind, or right to left thinking. So when we start on these projects with my team, I try to sit down and say, okay, you said it could be done by next, you know, Thursday at 5 p.m. What will success look like? Like when we're all done, if whether we're talking big pie in the sky and we decided to put a stake in the ground around it, or we're just talking about, I had a meeting earlier this morning about some stuff going on with legal. But one thing I talked to this particular person about before we left the room was, okay, you have until, I think we said, you have until the 21st to get it done, right? But what will that look, what on the 21st will you give me? And they said, oh, you'll get a thumb drive and it'll have this and this and this and this, and you'll have a shared drive and it'll have this and this and this. I'm like, okay, that absolutely meets my needs, right? So we were very clear and very intentional about what success would look like. And I think the more, and now that may be success 1.0. And then we may, like you said, Liz, we may decide, okay, when we get to that point, okay, let's polish it up and put a bow on it, make it look a little prettier, because, you know, we're going to go present this at some conference or something like that. Or in this case, it's going to go in front of a judge. So it's, I try to stay close to those things, but I always try to set expectations so people understand we both agree that, you know, on the 27th, we'll have this, and we you know, we can shake hands on that and we can move forward. The other thing I would tell you about, you know, when you first asked the question about time management, time audits, I worked with this senior executive when I was at Ericsson. He's now the CEO of another company, but I was super impressed by how much he was able to get done because this guy's plate was massively full. But when you went to him with an issue, he knew it, he was on it, and he introduced me to a concept called Take Back Your Life, which is, you talk about getting a lot of stuff done. He managed everything through Outlook. And when you looked at his calendar, it was color coded. He had time for everything. He just didn't take the knock on the door, hey, you got 10 minutes, I need to chat. That was kryptonite for this guy because he was so disciplined and scheduled. If you wanted 15 minutes with him, you knew you were having a weekly one-on-one. If it was 911, you could go to his admin and say, does he have 5 minutes for me? But I made the mistake working with him. I'd been there about 2 weeks. And late, it was like 5:30 on a Friday. Pretty much everybody was gone. And I knocked on his door and I was like, hey, you got 5 minutes? And he just kind of gave me this sideways look. And I realized, I didn't know at the time, I found out the following week, he had scheduled like 5:30 to 6:30, like email replies. So he was just heads down in email, getting back to people. And I was interrupting that. And so I've kind of tried to incorporate some of that in my day-to-day and shared that with my teams as I've moved forward. But it's one of those things that if everybody's doing it, works great. But if only half the people are doing it, then it's kind of like I'm speaking Spanish and you're speaking Greek, and we're not really communicating very well all the time.
That's a really good point you bring out. That was the question about operating procedures, because I think like you share, like, okay, I get clarity on like what you're delivering, when you're delivering it, how you're delivering it. I think that's great. But the question is it standard? Is it a standard operating procedure, or is it your operating procedure? And does this other leader have their operating procedure? And does this other leader have their operating procedure? Like how, how either, for any of your teams, like, is there clarity on what that standard operating procedure is around like asking for tasks and when it's getting delivered? Or is it not standard and kind of everyone's got their own way of doing things? And on top of that, I guess maybe the follow-on question is like, how many companies do you feel like have a standard operating procedure around assigning tasks and getting feedback or knowing what to expect when they're getting it back?
I think so. Early in my career, I did a consulting gig at Goldman Sachs in New York, and I was introduced to the Goldman way. And I was like, what is that? And they're like, oh, this is the size of font you use. This is the type of font you use. Here's how many bullet points. I mean, they were very specific. It all came from their marketing department, but they wanted everything that came from them to have a certain look and feel to it. In my experience, the larger companies who have marketing departments, communications departments, I mean, they are on this kind of stuff, publicly traded, because they want to be very consistent in their messaging. You'll see that. Smaller companies like mine, you may see that from Lotte. If you go back to South Korea and go to Seoul, they may be very intentional about that. But here in the US, I mean, we have our standard slide decks, but as far as, somebody could use one font, somebody else could use something else. Somebody could use a bunch of bullet points, somebody could use hardly any. That's a what you're describing to me is a very mature practice that in my experience, large organizations use. Smaller mom and pops or medium sized, they're focusing on driving revenue and keeping the doors open.
I 100% agree, because that is exactly what I had found at the larger companies I've worked for, where you had a marketing department that had that specific color, and everybody had to use that. Where my organization, we have 130 people, and it's kind of all hands on deck on everything. There's not a standard operating procedure. It's very scrappy. We get a lot done, but as we mature, I do think that we'll have to get more standard operating procedures. We just hired a chief of staff who, with that goal in mind, to get us a little bit more aligned, because we're kind of all over the place. But that's that growing organization, I think, like Steven's in. It's we're focused on revenue and not the color of the font necessarily, but someday that will be an issue for us for sure. So we don't have that standard operating procedure.
I'll chime in on it, not so much about color or font or kind of those specifics, but large or small, if there's a meeting, what's the purpose of the meeting? That should be in the invite, whether you're a small company or a big company. Who needs to be on the call? So you're not having 30 plus, 20 plus people on the call. How is information disseminated? I've had a lot of friends that have small businesses. I've worked for a startup where if you don't give clarity and you say charge, then you have 60 people charging and not all of them talking at the same time. So it goes back to Garrett, empowerment is key, but creating how we go about getting things done so that it removes frustration from people who are maybe working on the same thing, but those two groups didn't even know that they were working on the same thing because there wasn't communication. So it's not, I think it's more practicality of whose point, who's circling back, and then how we run the play. And I am a font, and if anybody who sees this that knows me, they'll know I like things pretty and I am a total font girl. But when it comes to just what's the purpose, who's involved, who needs to be there, pre-reads, right? I want to be able to come into a meeting understanding what's the point of the meeting and what do we need to get done so that everybody can walk away with the clarity that they need.
Yeah, I think that's good because I feel like, the question was mostly revolving around tasking work and the expectations received back from getting tasked. Now, definitely, I think like that expectation could be what's the color of the font, how many bullets do we use, what fonts do we use. I think that's like a distinct part of it. But yeah, Liz, I think you're hitting on a really good point of just like, what's the purpose of this meeting? And then the question I have, just like as a challenge, is why can't small companies have these things? Why can't small companies have these standard operating procedures? Because if we envision it as, we're an army and we're all charging towards this thing, you could have the archers, you could say charge, and they say, I can charge. Is that the best utility of my skill set? No, you probably would like me to have me back shooting arches or like arrows and stuff at the enemy or whatever from the way back, because that's really where I can do a lot of damage. Whereas if I'm running directly at them, if I get slashed, I lose pretty much my entire utility. Whereas you might want to have like the people with swords and shields or whatever being on the front lines.
And Garrett, something that I did at the startup from an operations perspective for deployments specifically, so it wasn't company-wide, it was for the operations team. We did establish what we called as rhythm and reviews, and it was cohorts aligned by vertical and by account. And so that rhythm and review was the team, even if they all didn't work for the same manager, the team that's supporting that client gets feedback on what's going well, what are the even betters, and that's shared within the team. And then the managers also get that feedback. So if you have someone that's more junior that maybe needs some coaching, or you have someone that's more senior that's sharing some great best practices, then I'm able to kind of see how those rhythm of reviews are humming, and I can pull a best practice and share it across. And so post-COVID, I don't think people were getting, or pre-COVID, sorry, it was just a different world. Then COVID happened, and now we're kind of in this hybrid, kind of more return to work kind of mandates that are happening. And I think more often, more touches are needed more frequently. And so how do you do that without, the formal performance reviews? We tried to make it fun. We tried to make it simple, but where it's touches regularly, right? And when we would tee it up, if you guys hate it, well, you know what? You're going to give me feedback on how this is working every 30 days. And it can change, it can evolve, and it can meet the broader team's needs just to make sure that we're all rowing in the same direction.
That makes me think about something I just started. We have a new CEO in our company. He's been here now, I think, 4 months, and very big on communication, but knowing that we have almost a brand new leadership team with very different ideas, and now we're trying to disseminate that down through the organization. We started these monthly kind of next leader down chats with the CEO where they can ask him anything, but then he can guide them, kind of give them his thoughts on leadership style, leadership practices, just as a start to get some consistency in thought as we mature and we grow and we try to put some of the other practices in place.
An idea, Shonna, that's fun too is an Ask Me Anything series, to where you have different leaders that are in a spot where they're framed up as Ask Me Anything, and you can give kind of guard rules around it, but spotlighting those, especially if you have a bunch of new leaders coming in, let employees come in and say, okay, ask me anything. And you can kind of put guardrails around what that leader's, what their role is and kind of what leadership tips or kind of what their style is, what are the lessons they've learned, and just to kind of help the conversation going, but allows employees to ask whatever they want, what's top of mind for them.
We actually, we do something very similar. We call it coffee chats. We have monthly coffee chats and we rotate the leaders, and sometimes the questions that come in are, kind of off the wall, but that's what makes it fun. And obviously that's top of mind for the employee, so we need to answer it.
Liz, you're circling on this topic that I know we're getting closer to the end here, but I want to just touch on it quickly because I think it's important. It's this concept of tactical versus strategic. When we think about the startup environment, sometimes you hear the words, oh, we're scrappy, which scrappy can be insinuated in a lot of different ways. One way you can insinuate scrappy is we'll do whatever it takes to get the job done. That sounds really admirable and advantageous. We lack the bureaucracy that stops things from getting done and happening. Another way of looking at scrappy is we may not be doing things efficiently, but we're certainly going to be working. We're going to be certainly moving. Will we be exhausted by the end of this? Yes. Will we have gone as far as we possibly could have gone? Maybe. Potentially not. And so I think where you're circling on is what is the right level of strategic to allow for the maximum outcome to occur? Because sometimes you hear about these big organizations, there's so much bureaucracy. Sure, they've put in so much strategic that it literally stops innovation from happening. No one can get anything done because literally no one can move the ball forward. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got a lot of inefficiency for the sake of scrappiness, but you've got 10 teams working on the exact same thing. No one knows that they're working on the exact same thing. They're all trying to solve it, and they've all come up with their own solutions. They all think their solution is best and right. Yes. And ultimately, you've got someone who's transitioning between departments and like, great, well, ops does it this way, HR does it this way, and finance does it this way. Which way is it the way to do it? Yes. So the question I have is, what is the optimum? How do we go about finding what that optimum balance of strategic versus tactical is when it comes to setting these standard operating procedures?
Stephen, Shonna, you want to respond first and I'll piggyback, or you want me to go first?
I mean, I'll take a stab. My first thought is whatever the CEO will support and help drive, right? Because what I have found in my career is that the message has to come from the top. And if it doesn't, it's very hard on big things. It's hard to drive those. But I think that as long as you're aligned at the very top of the organization, either direction you go, you'll be in a good spot.
Yeah. I think, Garrett, whether it's a small team in a big corporate or whether it's a startup, what are you modeling for your team? And I think that it's the balance that you're talking about. There's the startup mentality of we don't want big corporate. We're still at a startup. We don't want that to like kill our innovation. We don't want it to change kind of the culture of who we are. Well, you can keep that authenticity and you can speak about that authenticity. But if you want to get from point A to point B, we have to kind of pull up, the grown-up pants and start, defining what makes sense so that we're working smartly, right? Because like you said, if everybody's working on the same thing, you're being really inefficient. And I think there's my opinion is there's more of that that's happening than likely not if the communication lines aren't open, or there's not someone saying, okay, who's point A, point B, point C. And I'm not a micromanager, but I like to do those touches just to keep the pulse going. But you really need both. I don't know a startup that doesn't need, that can work without a process or work without that balance.
I have kind of a different twist to this. Sure. And, as I think about strategic and tactical, I think about leaders versus managers. And, I think sometimes we get them confused and we think a leader is doing those tactical things. In my mind, you have leaders who really are driving your strategy. They're empowering their teams. They're developing their teams. Then you have your managers who are doing those more tactical pieces. So it's kind of divide and conquer. The leader ultimately at the CEO level, in my opinion, Stephen, sets that objective exactly like you said. But then you've got this coalition of partners under you. They might be senior leaders, they might be other leaders in the organization who are driving the strategy, but it's very clear that the kind of that management level, I kind of think of a customer service manager. You got this tactical versus your leader who is doing that more strategic thinking and sharing that with the organization, making sure that the management teams are talking and sharing what they are doing. So it's, having both of these groups, understanding what the strategic objective is that you're going towards and that everybody gets it, but it's it's two different groups.
Yeah.
And with that, I would say in my organization, again, we're very small. So it's great to say that, as a leader, I'm only going to be strategic, not realistic. I get very tactical just because that's what you do in a small company. I don't have the people underneath me to always do that. So I guess utopia would be that you've got the managers doing more of the tactical work and then leaving the leaders to do the strategic and working together. So like I said, utopia, but that would be my recommendation.
My personal leadership style is if I only focus on strategic, I lose sight of what's happening at the tactical. Because I think the further away you get from that, you're not in the weeds. And then that brings back kind of the full circle of the conversation where people are like, they're asking for what? They have no idea. Well, it's because they've gotten so removed from the tactical, they don't understand. And so I think as a leader, for me personally, it's my responsibility to understand what the front line and the middle managers are experiencing so that I can tie back. It doesn't mean I can meet everybody's needs and make everybody happy, but it gives me a perspective so that I can balance, hey, here's the overall strategy of where we need to get to 2 years. And then to your point, Stephen, we need the lights on and we need the money coming in, revenue. That's what I'm going to, think about every single day. That's where that scrappiness comes into play. But if you get the revenue in, but you're not building for the long-term solution, the revenue is going to go away because you won't be able to sustain it, right? So it's that kind of that constant, continuous cycle, I think, Garrett, if that's an answer. I mean, it's a tricky question because I think it's this ongoing, continuous life cycle of strategy, tactical work, and then balancing those needs depending upon the levers that you need to dial into.
Yeah, I would just add one more thing. Like in my experience, I've seen and worked with the most senior leaders, and they may spend 85% of their time on, strategy, but you can still walk in their office at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday evening, and they've got their head down in an Excel file, or they're fine tweaking a PowerPoint that they're going to present, in 2 days to a large customer group or something like that. So as much as, senior leaders may want to talk about how strategic they are, I agree with you guys that you're always going to have a certain percentage of your time in the tactical, maybe because you're a control freak, maybe because you ultimately want this as polished as it can be, and you want to be the last person to look at it. Maybe all these people under you have done a great job, but you want to be the one to put a final tweak on it for whatever your reasons are. I've never met a senior leader who doesn't have some percentage of their time, perhaps small, that they're still dealing with the tactical.
Understanding the details.
Amazing. Well, Shonna, Liz, Stephen, this has been an awesome pre-symposium panel. I think we've covered a lot of really amazing topics during this discussion today. Really, really good conversation. If you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, gosh, I'd love to meet Shonna, Liz, and or Stephen, come to the executive symposium next week. I'll post a link in the message for this, or I'll put the link in the edit for this, or the details for this message, this post, on how to RSVP. We'd love to see you there June 13th, 5 to 8 p.m. At Schneider Electric in Carrollton. Topic is how to effectively lead multinational and multicultural teams. Thanks for your time, everybody. Have a